Good morning and welcome everyone. My name is Pernilla Klein and I'm Deputy CEO here at SNS. Today's seminar is about corporate governance and what's happening in the European Union in terms of regulation and harmonization. And today's seminar will be held in English because we have a guest of honor, a main speaker, who is Paul Myners, who you'll be listening to in just a few minutes. And Paul Myners is the former Minister for Financial Markets in the UK and now Chairman of Cevian Capital in the UK. We're very happy to have you here. This is the fifth lecture in our series here at SNS about corporate governance that we call SNS Corporate Governance Seminars. And this is an initiative that has been made possible by support by a group of SNS members that you see here on this slide, and so it's thanks to them that we are all here. The agenda for today is that we will start by listening to a presentation by Paulina Dejmeck-Hack, who is a cabinet member to Commissioner Michel Barnier, who is responsible for the initiatives and the proposals that we will be discussing today. And then it's time to listen to Paul Myners, who has promised to give us an outsider's perspective on the Swedish corporate governance model, a model that some say now is being challenged by EU regulatory agenda. And after that, we'll have a brief break for coffee, stretching our legs a bit, and then back we will end with a panel discussion where we'll be joined by Magnus Graner from the Ministry of Justice and Urban Funered from the Permanent Representation to Sweden and the EU. So now it's time to listen to Dr. Paulina Dejmeck-Hack, and Paulina has promised to give us an overview of the current initiatives and proposals from the Commission in the area of corporate governance. And Paulina is actually Swedish, but will be speaking English today. So, welcome to the stage.
Thank you very much, Pernilla, and a very good morning to all of you. Very happy to be here. I think it's the third time actually I speak here at the SNS, and it's always very interesting, and I'm looking forward to our discussion, which I'm sure will be quite lively because that's usually the case here. I prepared a couple of slides, very rather brief, on the corporate governance and as Pernilla mentioned, what the Commission is doing and planning to do in this area in the next future. First, maybe a couple of words on the context. Corporate governance companies obviously don't work in a legal vacuum. We are, as you all know, in a rather challenging situation in Europe since 5 years already, since the beginning of the financial crisis in 2008. We see a scenario where we at best have a zero growth, and as you know, the European Union is in a slight recession right now. We have unemployment which is peaking at levels over 10%, and in some countries youth unemployment that goes up to 30 or even 40%. This is obviously very problematic. It also means that we have to take action. We have to make sure that we in some way restore growth and competitiveness in the European Union. There will be no growth if we don't have successful companies. And in order to have successful companies, we need good company law, of course, but also a solid framework for corporate governance. So this is where we come from. This is where we think that the EU should act, that the EU has added value. Not to say that you need identical rules everywhere, but there is a clear internal market aspect here. We have many companies that work throughout the internal market, and it makes sense if we then have some general good principle of corporate governance that they all have to adhere to. Areas we are looking at are, and I will mention them in more detail in a short while. So oversight on executive remuneration, oversight on related part transaction, insufficient information on corporate governance, and what we mean there is the sometimes rather deficient explanations in those countries which apply a comply or explain approach. Difficulties in shareholder cooperation, and what we mean there is that it's sometimes difficult for shareholders to know what is still legal to do in terms of cooperation and where you will be caught by rules on acting in concert. Lack of transparency of proxy advisors, and also more generally, what can we do to enhance long-term shareholder engagement. In that context, the Commission launched in March a green paper on long-term investment, which look at this issue in a more broader context, so not only from the perspective of what can we do in terms of more engaged shareholders, but also accounting rules, what can we do in terms of prudential regulations, SMEs access to funding, and many other issues. This is a consultation which will be running until the end of June, and I would very much encourage you to reply, not only on the questions. I think we've asked about 25 questions in the areas I just mentioned, but you're obviously also welcome to more generally contribute your thoughts on what Europe can do in terms of long-term investment and long-term engagement. A long preparatory phase is behind us. Those of you who were around may remember the company law action plan from 1999. We had a number of quite important legal initiatives that were adopted in the beginning of the 2000s, with the takeover bid directive in 2004, the cross-border merger directive in 2005, and the shareholder rights directive in 2007. More recently, I'm sure you've been following it. We published a green paper first on corporate governance in financial institutions in 2010, then a corresponding exercise for the corporate sector in general in 2011. Last year we also did a targeted consultation on the future of company law, the action plan of last year in December, and now we are at a stage where we are carrying out some targeted consultations and studies, but also starting to implement some of the actions envisaged in the action plan in December last year. There is a time perspective here from the point of view that, as some of you know, the European Parliament will have elections next year. This means that in terms of legal proposals actually being adopted by the co-legislators, as you know, the European Commission is only making proposals. The ones who actually decide in the European Union are, on the one hand, the member states in the Council, and I'm sure that Urban can tell you more about that in a while, and on the other hand, the European Parliament. And due to the European parliamentary elections, if we want things to be adopted with the current European Parliament, the Commission is well advised to try to put out proposals at the latest the beginning of the autumn, because if not, there is a rather big risk that this will slip over to the next Parliament. Which is not the problem as such, but it will mean that things will be slightly delayed, and of course a new Parliament, we need some time to set up its committees, to organize itself, appoint new rapporteurs, and all those other matters. In terms of content, we see three main areas where we think action is needed, around three mottos, if you so wish. The first being enhanced transparency. This is something which Commissioner Barnier is very attached to, not only in the context of companies, but also more generally in the context of how financial markets work. First point I've listed here is disclosure of diversity policy and non-financial risk. This was a proposal which we have already put forward in April this year, with obliged big listed and non-listed companies with more than 500 employees to disclose their policy in terms of social and environmental matters, human rights, anti-corruption, and other issues, what we sometimes call non-financial reporting, or CSR, corporate social responsibility. We've tried to do this in a way which is as little burdensome as possible, in the sense that companies can choose themselves how they wish to do this reporting, using national, international, or EU standards. You can do this as a part of your annual report. You can also do it as a separate report. And if in the concept of a group, only the group needs to do this reporting and not the individual entities. So we have very much tried to bear in mind that we don't want to overburden companies here with new requirements. Also in terms of a diversity policy, an obligation only for listed companies, and this is not about quotas, this is about diversity in the widest sense of the word. Again, the obligation is to have a policy, or if you don't have a policy, to explain why this is not the case. As I mentioned, this is a proposal from April this year, so it has now passed on to the legislative procedure with, on the one hand, the European Council, the Council, and on the other hand, the European Parliament. Second point on transparency, I alluded to it earlier, improving corporate governance reporting in terms of comply or explain. The feedback we got from the green paper was that this is as such a very good system. It's good to have a code rather than having hard law. But many stakeholders also pointed out that the explanations sometimes are very weak, difficult to find, difficult to understand. So we think that there is a need to improve the system. This is probably an area where legislation wouldn't have much added value. So what we are thinking of would be to maybe do a recommendation from the Commission to Member States when it comes to improving corporate governance codes. Shareholder identification, important issue in the sense of if we want shareholders to be more engaged, you first of all need to know who they are. We are thinking of dealing with this issue in the context of where we look at shareholder ownerships and the transfer of property rights in the chain where securities are being sold. And this could be an occasion to also look at shareholder identification. Fourth point here, transparency of voting policies. Here we think in particular about institutional investors. The idea being that they should be obliged to be more transparent in their voting patterns and their policy on how they engage in a certain company. Not to say, of course, I mean, we are fully aware that there are privacy concerns here, so not going into every single detail, but being transparent on the more kind of general objectives pursued and the general voting pattern taken. The second main area of action, and I've alluded to it several times already, engaging shareholders. This is not to say that the only route forward here is shareholders. We think that shareholders have a very important role to play. We think that we've seen in the past that shareholders sometimes have not been as active as we think would have been good. That is not to say that it's only by empowering shareholders that you will have a perfect system of corporate governance or solve all the world's problems. So this is one line of action among many, and that's something I would like to emphasize, because I know that it's sometimes perceived as if the Commission would think that the only thing that matters in the world is to have more powerful shareholders. Anyway, on remuneration policy, say on pay, we had the famous shareholder spring movement that started last year. You may have seen the referendum in Switzerland, which went relatively far in terms of giving a shareholder control on executive pay. What we are thinking of here is to foresee a shareholder vote on the general policy on remuneration, the report published every year on what remunerations have been given, and possibly also on individual remunerations, but it's something which we are still looking at, and there's also the issue of whether this should be a binding vote or an advisory vote. Some member states have a binding vote in this context, others don't. I think we would probably tend to think that in some circumstances the binding vote can be very helpful, but it's something which we are still looking at. Improved oversight of related party transactions. What we have in mind here is to when a shareholder or board member enters into a transaction with the company itself, to have more transparency around this. One could think, for example, about requiring an independent evaluator if for transactions over a certain threshold, or also a shareholder vote. Proxy advisors, important issue. Proxy advisors, as you know, play a very important role. A lot of investors with a dispersed shareholding cannot possibly themselves follow what's going on in all the companies where they are active. That being said, though, we think that there is an issue sometimes around conflict of interest as far as proxy advisors are concerned. This is something which the SEC in the US has also been looking at. ESMA did a consultation on this matter a couple of months ago and concluded that it would be useful if the sector could come forward with a code of conduct. And again, the key word here is transparency, being clear on how those proxy advisors, they need to explain how they manage potential conflicts of interest that can occur in during their activities. Last point here, clarification of the concept of acting in concert, which figures notably in the takeover bids directive. We did a study of that directive and how it has been applied on the ground in member states last year. Our conclusion was that it has actually worked relatively well. It's a directive which we, for the time being, don't intend to revise. However, something which was pointed out to us by many stakeholders was that the rules around acting in concert are applied differently in different member states, which creates legal uncertainty, especially in cross-border situations. Investors don't know how the approach taken in another country as far as the issue is concerned. So we do think there may be added value here in terms of trying to elaborate guidelines or other kind of giving some help to make sure that this concept is interpreted in a similar way across the European Union. Last line of action, here we are more in the core of company law rather than corporate governance, supporting companies' growth and competitiveness. One major issue here pointed out by stakeholders in our consultation in the Green Paper was to improve the framework for cross-border operations. There is the issue of companies being able to transfer their seat without having to liquidate and incorporate again in the new country. This is tricky. We are at the core of company law here. We have case law from the European Court of Justice, which is not entirely clear in this area. So this is something we are looking at. We did a targeted consultation on this issue, which just finished. We got around 70 replies. And we are looking at that, and we'll have to see if we take this forward. But bearing in mind that this is a very complex question where you touch on social law, labor law, and many other rather delicate matters. Improving the mechanism for cross-border mergers. I mentioned it earlier, we have a directive from 2005, which has worked relatively well, but the comments being made to us is that here also we have some issues of legal certainty, some issues of different interpretations in different member states, and that there may be need to look a little bit on what we can do in that context. Cross-border divisions, we have a European directive from 1982, I think, on domestic divisions. There is no corresponding European framework for the cross-border divisions. This is something that we may look at, and if we were to do that, it would then be in the context of the cross-border mergers directive, seeing whether one could also add certain rules when it comes to divisions of companies cross-border. European legal forms, as some of you may remember, we proposed quite a few years ago a European statute for a European private company. The idea being that Europe needs a common legal form, a limited liability company. The idea being that this would be something for smaller companies that want to be active in more than one member state. They should have one statute wouldn't need to bother about local company law in 5 or 6 or how many member states they want to be active in, but could use the European statute. Unfortunately, this proposal, which requires unanimity, meaning that all member states have to agree, is blocked since a couple of years already. We unfortunately don't really see how we can unblock it, so we are right now looking at other ways of maybe trying to encourage some kind of common legal European structures, which would then be a bit different from the European private company, since this one has unfortunately visibly not being able to be as successful as we would have hoped. In the same context, we also want to launch an awareness campaign as far as the European company is concerned, the Societea Europea, existing also now for almost 10 years. It has been used by a few European companies, Nordea, for example, here in Sweden. We also have the German Insurance Allianz, which have restructured their business to become an SE. Here we don't intend to open up the regulation, the SE statute, but we think there is added value in terms of trying to make businesses aware that this European legal form actually exists, and that it may be an interesting alternative for big companies that are already today active throughout the internal market. Last point here, a codification of European company law. This is not linked to content, but more making sure that our 10 or so European company law directives would be modernized and put together in one European code of company law. So this is a pure codification exercise, but making the law more easy, accessible to users and to member states. So this is a project which is running and which we hope will be able to finish next year. I'm coming to my last slide, but I do believe it's a rather important one. We are sometimes criticized in the sense of the Commission thinking that you need to reinvent the wheel. We are fully aware that there are a lot of best practices out there when it comes to corporate governance. I think it's no secret that some member states are more advanced than others in this field. You will also appreciate that from the European Commission point of view, we need to look at the 27, soon 28 member states. So you may well think that, well, the Swedish system is working very well, and why would we need to change anything at all? The way we look at it is that, yes, that's absolutely, there are good systems out there, the Swedish being one, the United Kingdom, for example, also being very advanced, but we need to look at this also from the perspective of the level playing field for a company that wants to be active in more than one member state. And what we think here is that, yes, we should definitely try to look at the best practices already existing, expand those good systems that are already in place, but always with bearing in mind what does this mean in terms of a level playing field and internal market. A bit in the same vein, one size does not fit all. We do appreciate that. Companies are very different within a member state, but certainly between different member states. We also appreciate that countries have different tradition. Company law, which of course goes hand in hand with corporate governance, is very different in different member states. We have, I mean, just to mention one example, which is well known to all of you, the different board structures, the 2-tier board versus the 1-tier board. A question that arises very easily then is to say, for example, when we speak about shareholder engagements, what traditionally is considered to be a shareholder area in a 1-tier system is often something which actually the supervisory board deals with in the 2-tier system. And that's, as you know, the case in, for example, Germany and Austria. So when we look at European solutions here, internal market solutions, we of course have to bear in mind that we do have different company law structures out there, and it's certainly not the Commission's intention to interfere with the core of national company law. We do think diversity is an asset, not only in the field of company law, but more generally. That's something my commissioner refers to very often. He thinks that the diversity we have in Europe, be it in terms of structures of banks or insurance companies, or companies in general, it's a good thing. We don't want to impose a straitjacket on anyone. The diversity is there, it should remain, but again, we do think that we need sometimes a European framework and European enabling framework. And last but absolutely not least, it is important not to overburden companies. We try to be as flexible as we can here. Rules from the European level should be proportionate. They should of course not go further than what is absolutely necessary. When it is possible to basically leave the implementation to the member state, or even better, to the company itself, we definitely think that is the right way forward. I mentioned earlier as an example what we've done on non-financial reporting, where we said, okay, this is an obligation, but companies can deal with it the way they consider fit. I think we think that this is a good way forward in this area, and this is certainly something which we will bear in mind when we are drafting legislation in the future. I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
You presented the action plan in December. What have the reactions been so far? Is it that it's too much regulation and interference, or is it was too little?
I think it's been rather mixed, as one would expect with that kind of document. I mean, there have clearly been the reaction where people have thought that, Commission, you have been working on this for so long, you've done a green paper, you've done target consultation, you advertise your action plan for a year, and at the end, there is nothing new in there. Could you not have been a bit more ambitious? So that's, I think, the one side of the spectrum. The other side, then, being also, as could be expected, the ones that would say a little bit what I alluded to on my last slide. Why is the Commission getting involved here at all? Leave this to member states, leave this to companies. There is no one size fits all, and why you're trying to impose European rules. I think the way we look at it, that probably means that we are about right. I mean, the balance is right if we are criticized from both sides. So we would tend to believe that we have more or less identified the right issues where we think that we should take things forward.
I was thinking about your last slide there, saying one size does not fit all. It seems that you're more open to self-regulation as a tool to implement rules. I see a bit of a different tone as if we look over the last 10 years, where first perhaps more rules-based prescriptive regulation, and now more relying on diversity. So you agree with that?
I mean, obviously things do change in the course of 10 years. I think as far as the current commission is concerned, so the mandate of Commissioner Barnier, which started in February 2010, I actually think that we have, from the very beginning, in this particular area, have the sense that we need a kind of a sound mix of hard law, if you wish, and on certain areas, soft law. It may be, however, that we have maybe not been as successful in communicating this as we maybe thought, because it seems to me that the criticism that the Commission wants to regulate everything in corporate governance, that's something which we have been hearing for the last couple of years. And if you look at the Green Paper, if you look at the Action Plan, it says very clearly that we want to respect the diversity. We don't want to overburden companies. We want this to be a balanced approach, but it seems that has been overlooked, and maybe that's our fault that we have not been able to communicate that as well as we should have.
One strand of criticism is what we heard we had in last seminar in this series. We had Professor Paul Myners here from the UK, and he was saying the problem with the EU agenda is that it's very much focused on shareholder rights, shareholder value perspective, and that is part of the mechanism that caused the financial crisis. Because if you create too much power for shareholders, there will be short-term shareholders kidnapping the agenda. Was that a criticism that you've heard in Brussels?
It's definitely a remark which has been made to us, and that's also the reason why I, in my presentation, tried to emphasize the fact that shareholder engagement it's one, we think, important line of action here, but it's not the only one. You need to see it in the context of more generally what we can do on terms of transparency, what we can do in terms of making compliant explain codes work better. And also, I think, yes, shareholders are important, but they should not, I mean, they're not the only answer, if I may put it that way. And it's true that especially institutional investors probably sometimes have had a bit of a short-term perspective. We think that what we try to do here in terms of more transparency, requiring investors to be transparent on what their engagement is for a company, what policies they have, we do think that that could actually encourage a more long-term thinking. But you need to explain what you're doing than just saying, well, I want the highest profit possible as quickly as possible. It's maybe not what you would necessarily put in your policy. So we do think, again, with this mix of different tools, we do hope that we will make a step forward.
So we will see what Paul Myners and the other discussants here have to say about this. So thank you, Paulina. We will get a chance to chat with you more during the discussions here. Thank you. So now it's time to introduce today's microphone. Oh no, yes, no mic. Or maybe I'll stand over here. Here you hear me. Paul Myners started his career in the investment management industry as a chief executive and later also chairman of Gartmore Investments. He has served as board member and chairman of a number of listed companies, Marks & Spencer being one of them. And he was appointed Minister for Financial Markets in Gordon Brown's Labour government just after the collapse of Lehman Brothers, and he was responsible for managing the recapitalization of the British banking system. And Paul also has a long track record of public service, with being responsible for a total of 5 reviews for the UK government on issues relating to investment and ownership. And in the year 2000, you presented a groundbreaking report that scrutinized the investment management industry and introduced principles of best practice for pension funds. And this review came out just as the AP fund system here in Sweden was being reformed. And I know that it did have quite a significant influence on this reform here. And your current link to Sweden is that you serve as chairman of Saving Capital in the UK. So with your background, I can think of no one better equipped to enlighten us on the topic of corporate governance failures and what can be done to fix them. So it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Paul Myners. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Pernilla. I'm glad you've taken down the photograph you had there of me originally, which was taken in 2008 when I became a government minister, and is a strong testament to the damage that life in politics can do to your appearance and your life expectancy. The photograph was taken against the backdrop of the central courtyard of the Treasury in Westminster, and as a sign of how seriously we're taking deficit reduction in the United Kingdom, that area was recently let out by the Treasury to the makers of the most recent Die Hard film as background for a nightclub, believe it or not. Pernilla, thank you very much for your introduction. You've said that I'm going to be lively. I will endeavour to be lively. I'm also quite loud, so I'm not sure that I need the the microphone. I prefer to wander around a little, so if nobody can hear me, please put your hand up and I'll go back and hide behind the rostrum. But I prefer to be visible and fully accountable. As Pernilla says, I am a partner in Saving Capital, which is an investment management firm which has its origins here in Stockholm, but is now the largest manager in Europe of equity portfolios with an absolute return objective, where we now have the majority of our employees outside Stockholm, although we have a significant office still here in Sweden, but we have offices in London and in Switzerland. And in fact, 2/3 of our portfolio is currently invested outside the Nordic regions, and most of our funding from our clients come from outside the Nordic regions. But Cevian is a very significant presence in European fund management. There is no larger European equity fund with an absolute return than Cevian Capital. I want to focus on two things. I want to focus on the distinguishing features of the Swedish approach to corporate governance, and to emphasize my belief that this is a model which has considerable merit, and indeed to stress to you that it is one which is increasingly being recognized as such elsewhere in Europe and the world. There is a debate now taking place elsewhere in the world amongst informed people about what we can learn about the clear and evident advantages of the Swedish or Scandinavian approach to corporate governance. And secondly, I want to talk about the European proposals, which Paulina has excellently summarized. And my contention there is going to be that, worthy as they are, and I cannot dispute many of the proposals, they actually fail to address the core problem. I'm currently writing a book about what I believe is the core problem. And when you're writing a book, your great fear is that somebody else is going to publish your book before you finished it. And I suppose I could have had a fear that the European Commission was going to publish my book. Well, they haven't. They've missed the issues. Most of the proposals are based upon assertions which are not strongly rooted in evidence. The language does not withstand close scrutiny as to meaning, and the proposals are unlikely to lead to beneficial outcomes in terms of social coherence, economic return, and accountability of capital. Let me start, if I may, with a little bit of how did I get into this area of, why have I written 5 reports on corporate governance and corporate ownership? Why do I think this is such an important issue? And I do. I think there is a lot of evidence, which I can cite, that the prevailing model of dispersed ownership, which is the core problem here, is costing us serious amounts of money in terms of lost economic growth, because our capital determination and focus is increasingly on short-term rather than long-term investment. That is a social problem, that is an economic problem, which goes beyond the limited world of people who wear anoraks and are fixated with corporate governance or the architecture of corporate governance. In 1985, I was appointed chief executive of a small fund management business called Gartmore, which at that stage managed about $1.5 billion. We had 4 clients. I had previously spent 12 years with the investment bank NM Rothschild, again primarily on the investment management side. Because of a UK legal requirement that fund managers disclose their shareholdings when they went above 3% and then at various thresholds after that, each morning I got a computer report. Our computer room at that stage, this is 1985, our computer room was about as big as this room. I imagine the function is now done on a laptop, which told me the percentages we own of various companies, so that we could make sure we complied with our disclosure requirement. I used to run my finger down the list, and I would see lots of 0.1%, 0.3%, 0.4%, 1%, never much more than 1% of an individual company. But our business grew. Over the next 15 years, we grew from $1.5 billion under management to $120 billion under management. And these numbers got bigger. 3%, saw the occasional 5% that we earned. And then I started seeing some 10% and 15%. This, incidentally, is one of the flaws in the asset management business, that the primary driver of value is asset accumulation to drive up your fee revenue, and that clients should be much more alert about the pace at which fund management groups grow and how they manage growth, but that's a side issue. But when we were getting 10, 15% holdings, I started in a discussion with my colleagues and said, what does this mean? When we own 0.1%, 0.2%, it didn't seem to me we had any great responsibilities as companies. We were pursuing performance, pursuing the performance objectives that had been set for us by our clients. But when we owned 5 or 10%, were we morphing into somewhere where instead of thinking about our shareholding in terms of being a tradable asset, where we had rights and entitlements, were we now in a situation where we had responsibilities and obligations? Had our holdings become so large that exit was no longer the preferred option in terms of governance? Remember, academics talk about the primary responsibility of shareholders being exercised in two ways, either by exit or by voice. Was voice becoming more important? Should we be behaving differently? So I saw this emerging issue of a reluctance on the part of my colleagues and our competitors to acknowledge that we had certain responsibilities as owners of businesses, which is why I started writing reports. The first report I wrote for a British government, which was a right-wing government. I'm a left-of-centre politician, but my first two reports were for right-wing conservative governments. First one was called Towards a Winning Partnership, the focus being the relationship between the company and the shareholders. The second one was called Quality Dialogue, which again was trying to talk about how we could get more meaningful engagement in that area. And then, as Pernilla said, a more seminal report in 2001, which talked about investor responsibility, accountability, and the case for stewardship and activism. I joined my first public company board, a FTSE 100 company, when I was in my mid-30s. I joined a number of other boards while I was still at Gartmore, and in 2001 I retired from Gartmore. I always hoped to retire from full-time working at around about that stage in my life, and I then went into my next stage of my career, which was as a public company director and as a chairman. And I saw things from the other side of the table there. I saw that whereas my engagement as a fund manager with companies was about harvesting information, not the quality dialogue I'd sought to promote, but actually a one-way process in which management every 6 months was put in front of the institutional shareholders and asked for information, that on the other side of the table you realised you were getting nothing back from the shareholders. You were given no direction. They own the business, or that they as fiduciaries own the business on behalf of the ultimate asset owner, but you got no direction from them at all. This seems strange, odd. You'd expect the owners of the business to be the ones who, if not setting the strategic framework, were certainly agreeing the strategic framework. I found when I defended Marks and Spencer's against a takeover bid, our shareholders were extraordinarily short-term in their focus. The Commission seems to believe it's right to encourage mergers and acquisitions and to facilitate cross-border transactions. I think the evidence would suggest the Commission should be slowing that process down, because we know how such transactions can frequently be so damaging to the parties and shareholders involved. When I became chairman of Land Securities, the largest real estate company in Britain, I wrote to our 20 large shareholders saying I was chairman, I'd like to meet with them to discuss their concerns, if they had any, about the company. I told the company secretary I was going to put my mobile telephone number on the letter. He was shocked, horrified by this. He said, some of them might ring you. I said, yes, that's why I'm giving them the number. I prevailed, and the letter was sent. I topped and tailed it very nicely, wrote a little something at the bottom to prove that each letter didn't come straight off a PC. But 18 of the 20 failed to even respond or acknowledge receipt of the letter. One responded, one telephoned and thanked me, and in 3 years as chairman of Land Securities, not a single shareholder wanted to meet with me as chairman of the board. This, I hasten to add, being defensive, is not because of something that is deficient in my personality or character, because I found when I talked to other chairmen that exactly the same thing happened. In 2008, I became a government minister. I was invited into government by Gordon Brown to handle the negotiations with our failed banks. So I joined the government on the 28th of September, a fortnight after the collapse of Lehman Brothers, and I served as a government minister for 18 months. I met the bankers, I negotiated with the bankers, I looked at the boards of directors, I realised in the course of understanding what happened at Royal Bank of Scotland and HBOS how poor those boards of directors had been. The board of RBS actually ticked all the boxes in terms of diversity, experience, seniority of independent directors. However, there was a flawed assumption that the directors would read their board papers, which it was quite clear they hadn't done. I have to say, by diversion, a little moment, I sat on the board of a bank as part of my plural career, in which the board papers came in a large waxed envelope. This board was in America. I had to fly to the States. It took me most of the flight from London to New York to read my board papers. I couldn't watch any films or anything of that sort. It was not possible to open this waxed envelope without making a terrible noise, and it was not possible once opened to reseal it. And one of the directors I used to sit next to would, at the board meetings, tear open his envelope, which was clear evidence that he had not looked at the papers at all. He, on the whole, used to sit next to me on the board table, which was quite frustrating because the chairman, who was also chief executive of this particular board, regularly moved us up and down the table, depending on whether we were in favour or out of favour. I spent much of my time on that board sitting out on the balcony. So that, by way of background, is how I got to where I was, and in particular when I was a minister, saying, how did this happen? How did our major banks get themselves in such a terrible position? And what did I find? No pressure on the shareholders to account for what they've done. Last week I met with probably the most senior investment consultant in Europe. And I asked him, this is a man who spends quite a lot of his time in investor meetings with clients, had he seen fund managers challenged as to what they were doing when the banks were building up this excessive risk and their failure to manage it? He had not attended a single meeting in which that question had been asked. Investors, your pension fund, your mutual fund, your insurance policy lost billions of dollars, and not a single question had been asked. Because in most cases, banks were held in portfolios at around about index weighting, and we'll come to that in a minute. So inasmuch as you lost no more than other managers lost, it didn't become a fundamental question that fund managers had to answer. That is largely due to the flawed setting of investment objectives, which lies at the heart of the ownerless corporation, as I've described the public company model. In my search to understand what the owners of the businesses were doing when the banks failed, or to be more clear, what they were not doing, I met the chairman of the audit committees of all the major banks. They were very reluctant to meet with me because I wanted one-to-one meetings, and they all wanted to bring with them their external auditors, with whom the relationship is far too close. They wanted to bring with them their company secretary, their legal advisor, and I said, no, I just want to talk. And in the end, we agreed that they could bring with them a note taker. I met 4 chairs of audit committees of our major banks in the UK. I could tell you only one of them was able, within the first 3 minutes, to avoid saying, actually, I don't know much about VAR or CDO squares. I don't know how to feed volatility into a valuation model, but rely upon me, old boy. I've been around a long time. I can look in somebody's eye and tell them I can tell whether they're telling me the truth. I don't need technical detail at all. Quite extraordinary. How many of them had been asked to see the shareholders? Not a single one. What's going on here? Hundreds of billions of pounds lost, huge damage to the economy and to the taxpayer, and the people who own these flawed institutions are not being held to account. They clearly did not see themselves as having an ownership responsibility. Let's turn to the Swedish approach. There is very strong support in the United Kingdom for the Swedish approach to governance. So strong that both of us are here in the room today. My colleague Harlan Zimmerman and I. The truth is that there is an increased debate and awareness of the Swedish model, and in particular this distinguishing feature of the shareholders being involved in a nominations committee, and an increased recognition by very senior fund managers and corporates that this model has a logical integrity. It is a good model, and the arguments now fall back to ones of practicality and implementation, that Sweden has a more concentrated ownership structure, that it's a more cohesive society, etc. But people are no longer saying it's a flawed approach, except those who have something to risk as a consequence of the adoption of the Swedish model. They are now saying, well, it's a good idea, but it's not really practical for us to adopt it. There are ways which Harlan and I have devised which are practical. What makes the Swedish approach distinguished from and strong compared with others? Quite simply, that the board of directors, the independent directors, are appointed by the owners. In the UK, we have nominations committees. Indeed, we have hundreds of committees in corporate governance, because one of the consequences of the focus on corporate governance has been that we've largely looked at structure rather than behaviour, and so we've come up with architecture rather than principles of behaviour as solutions. So we have a nominations committee comprised largely of independent directors. Believe me, as somebody who's sat on the board over my career of 10 of our largest companies, independent directors are appointed by the chairman. They are not appointed by the nominations committee. There may be a nominations committee process, but invariably the independent directors are chosen by the chairman. And I think Mr. Tresco, who has made a valuable contribution to debate here in Sweden and increased awareness, I think, of the fact that your approach is different, has perhaps overstated, from his perspective as a chairman, the value of the UK approach. We now require all independent directors to stand for annual re-election. This would seem to be an ideal approach to make directors accountable to shareholders. So over the summer, 3,000 independent directors will stand for re-election as to shareholder boards of our top 300 or so companies. I can forecast now, without any doubt, that of those 3,000 candidates, not a single one will not be elected. 100% support. Not even Kim Jong-un in North Korea believes that he can get away with an election which he says has 100% endorsement. This is because the process is not taken seriously. Some people will tell you, well, actually candidates are weeded out before they stand for election. And there's a little bit of truth to that. But don't allow that to take our eyes away from the fact that the system is fundamentally flawed. The Scandinavian approach of putting the shareholders on the nominations committee creates a real relationship between the owners and the independent directors. The independent directors know they are there because they have the support of the shareholders, not just the support of the chairman. They are more likely to be challenging because they have a very clear mandate. And in the process of developing the mandate, they have established a constructive dialogue with the institutional shareholders. Remuneration, which takes up a lot of time in the area of governance, is best handled by an informed board with the lead in that area coming from the independent directors. Those independent directors' authority in that area is best promoted by having a very clear mandate from the shareholders. So the Swedish model, I believe, is a very superior one by comparison with the models in America and the UK and in a number of other environments, because of the establishment of clear relationships and a strong mandate. In engaging with Mr. Tresco on this subject, I would have to say, however, that a poorly implemented Swedish process is likely to produce a less good outcome than a superbly implemented UK process. Architecture does not guarantee outcomes. The EU on the whole believes it does, but architecture does not guarantee outcomes, and a superbly implemented UK process would borrow extensively from the Swedish approach, in almost certainly involving a lot of consultation with shareholders about the sort of people that should be on the board. The UK process, John Kay and the code talks about consultation with shareholders. I can tell you how consultation works because I've been on both sides of consultation. Consultation is a phone call at 6 o'clock on the evening before saying we're going to appoint John Smith to the board tomorrow morning as an independent director. We hope you're happy with that. The press release has gone out. There's something in aeronautics when a plane is on the runway and it's going so fast, I think it's called Vector 2 or V2, when it's not possible, even though the plane's wheels are still on the ground, to stop the takeoff. The pilot applies the brakes, the plane disintegrates. That is what we call consultation under the UK model. It clearly is inadequate. And I think Mr. Tresco has overstated, as I say, from the perspective of a man who holds the chairmanship and therefore holds the key to the appointment of members of his board, the advantages of the UK model. Now let me just say a few words about the EU proposals, and I've watched these through their gestation. I've said to you that I think the issue of corporate governance is very important to economic performance and social outcomes, and not just an area for those who are interested in corporate governance for its own sake. Let me declare my own position on the EU, because the UK gets a lot of publicity. I'm pro-EU. I would like to see many of the things which David Cameron is focused on in terms of the EU recognising and reorganising the allocation of some responsibilities and pushing more back to national governments and less from Brussels. I don't think we'll be successful in renegotiation. I think we're doing considerable harm to the UK economy. A tricky point in raising questions about whether we wish to remain members of the EU, but there's no doubt that the majority of the members of the largest party in the coalition, the majority of the members of Parliament of the largest party in the coalition would vote today to leave the EU if they could. The initial green paper from the EU on the area of corporate governance was published in 2010 in light of failures in the financial sector, and I suppose that was good because at least the EU was looking at this issue, and perhaps in parallel to when I was, when a lot of people were putting their heads in the sand. And that paper then was subsequently reflected in the framework of CRD 4 when that was announced. I understand why the EU is doing this. Politicians are under a lot of pressure. How did this happen? We're dealing with the social consequences of financial market failure. What were you doing? Where did regulation fail? It appeals to politicians to find scapegoats, to find people they can blame, and so corporate governance is one of the areas where they can possibly put blame and say it wasn't our fault. These businesses had bad boards of directors and deficient shareholders. politicians are having to deal with the painful consequences of explaining to electors outcomes which are uncomfortable. But it's important that to us remember, when we looked at Paulina's excellent presentation, that there was little pressure from the investment community or the business community for European Commission action here. And I think Paulina used language when asked by Pernilla, what's the response been, to say it had been mixed. Well, in the world of politics, you know, when your permanent secretary says to you, reaction, Minister, to your proposals has been mixed, I think we can say reaction has been pretty grim. There is very little positive endorsement for the European Commission's proposals here. Let's be frank about that. Hardly anybody is saying this is the answer to all our problems. Implementation of this programme and our economic future will be secure. The reason why there's so little enthusiasm, because there's little in this proposal which is going to make the slightest bit of differences. The 16-point action plan, I'm a naturally combative individual. I love a good, fierce debate. It's in the tradition of where I come from. I find it very difficult to find anything worth debating in this proposal. I am in support of gender balance, but it's going to happen in any case. I don't understand why the EU is fixated on setting targets for independent directors by gender balance, but not for executive directors. That's the real issue. The waste of talent is in executive directors. If we had more female executive directors, we'd have more female independent directors. The EU's gone chasing after completely the wrong rabbit when it comes to gender balance. I don't have any difficulty with more transparency about who owns shares. I think the EU is right to say that we probably ought to look at proxy agents, but please, please, please. We tried to blame credit rating agencies for part of the financial crisis. Yes, they were a small part of the blame, but not the big part. It was the people who were using the credit rating agencies who were at fault. Likewise, the proxy agents, yes, let's look at them. Let's have a bit more regulation. There is some conflict of interest there. But the real flaw, I'm coming to a close, Pernilla. I'm only just getting going now. I really, the real flaw is elsewhere, and I'm now going to. Where is the real flaw? The absence of accountable ownership. The absence of accountable ownership is a direct consequence of the goals that investment managers are set, which are around relative performance benchmarks. They are not set long-term goals. We become increasingly short-term focused. We increasingly have distributed ownership, which means we have to look to non-executive directors to act as surrogates for the owners, loco parentis, rather than having owners sitting on the board. The EU favours one share, one vote. I don't. I now go against the prevailing theocracy of 40 years of my career and say that we should support differential voting. I think we need to slow down the markets. I'm in support of a financial transaction tax in some respect. We need to make shareholders much more accountable than they are. We need to recognise that the relative performance benchmark is flawed. The absolute benchmark, you search for an efficient frontier between risk and reward. Take more risk, get more reward. Want more reward, take more risk. That all falls apart when you use the relative performance benchmark. You end up with this really odd thing. 30% of equities in portfolios are described as underweight. Underweight means you own less than the index within your benchmark. This has really perverse incentives. If you're underweight in a stock, it actually means you have no incentive at all to improve that company. If that company is improved by your actions, by appointment of a strong independent board, by an approach to strategy which cuts out peripheral value-destroying activities, the share price will rise faster than the index, your clients will be unhappy, and you'll lose the mandate. So we actually have 30% of our shares are owned by people who are betting on the company failing. Isn't that extraordinary? And with that, I will hand you back to Pernilla.
Okay, thank you, Paul. please stay up here. I want to. I just taken a decision that Paul Myners' presentation was so lively, engaging. We don't need coffee.
Sorry, I do apologise.
And we will have a chance to have a cup of coffee afterwards. So that's my solution. One question, Paul. You've talked a lot about the problems at hand. Yeah. Okay, and you did mention only briefly, where are the solutions and where is this change coming from? Is it from policymakers or is it from the institutional investment management community that should rethink their whole business model?
Policymakers have some responsibility to create a framework which will be conducive to effective action. A basic structure of financial law, codes and practices, but those need to be rooted in reality. One of the problems with comply or explain, which is the heart of much of our work in this area, as you know, Pernilla, is explain to who. And explain, and it's not, with all respect, Paulina, about fuller explanations. It's not about going from one paragraph to 5 paragraphs. It's about the fact that the explanation is not subject to appropriate challenge. And why isn't? Because most shareholders own shares in just about every business. They own 1% here, 1% there. They have no incentive to do anything. So we've got to, we need to look at how that operates. It doesn't actually lie with fund managers, Pernilla. It ultimately lies with fund owners. We have an inverted structure in which the people with the most experience, the most focus and the highest reward make the least significant decisions of all in diversified portfolios, sort of making little bets around the index, and they get paid hundreds of thousands of euros. And the people who make the most important decisions, which are setting portfolio objectives and risk tolerances, are frequently lay members of boards of various funds who get paid very little and often don't have a great deal of relevant experience. So we need to empower the governance of fund owners and then get clearer investment objectives, including less use of relative performance benchmarks.
So really what we need to do is to regulate pensions management, or to give a framework for who gets to sit on a board of a pension fund. Is that the solution?
Well, I think that's where the weaknesses lie. I mean, the Chinese are saying the smell of the rotting fish comes from the head, and if at the commencement point of the investment chain, the voice of the client is setting the wrong objectives. Clients who consistently hire and fire managers with no requirement to evidence why they made their decisions and indeed whether they're any good at that is a weak structure. So strengthen that, set clearer benchmarks, manage performance over appropriate timescales. I mean, I think any fund manager who sits in front of you with a diversified portfolio and says we had a good year is pulling the wool over your eyes, because the chances that that is a reflection of talent are very low. Bill Sharp says you need, the Stanford professor says you need 40 years of observed performance in a widely diversified portfolio to tell whether the outcomes reflect skill, talent, or good fortune. So set benchmarks of 5 years, 10 years. Towers Perrin are running a program now, Towers Watson running a program now where they're giving 10-year mandates. This seems to me to be a step in the right direction. The fund managers then will follow on what the clients want. Fund managers are very greedy people. I was a fund manager for 30 years. I aspired to be embarrassingly rich. And the best way of being embarrassingly rich was doing what my clients wanted me to do. If the clients set the right objectives, the fund managers will change their behaviours. And if you had more concentrated portfolios with higher conviction, fewer stocks, and with an expectation that the managers would behave differently, then you get good outcomes. Final sentence on this. The same consultant I was speaking about earlier on last week, I said, tell me, have you seen a manager who has managed to maintain a mandate, retain a mandate, when investment performance has been quite poor against relative benchmark over several years, but that manager is clearly putting a lot of resource and effort into governance? He said he had never seen a single example of that happening. This is why governance is peripheral, it's detached, it's irrelevant. under the current model of distributed ownership and diversified portfolios.
Okay, thank you. We'll discuss this more when we welcome our panel today. And Paul, please stand over here we want you for this continued discussion. We're not letting you go just yet. And for our panel, we have Magnus Graner, who is from the Ministry of Justice, and you're responsible for the parts of EU governance regulation that concerns corporate law and regulation of auditors. And then our second panelist is Urban Funered, who represents the Swedish government in Brussels, or the Ministry of Finance in Brussels, as a financial attaché at the Sweden's permanent representation to the EU. And you are also involved in negotiating governance regulation, especially when it comes to banks. So, I mean, one of the reasons we have this seminar here, Magnus and Urban, is that there's been a lot of criticism locally here in Sweden, and there's been talk on the proposed EU regulation on corporate governance, and there's been talk of the Swedish corporate governance model being under threat. And are these concerns shared by the Swedish government?
Thank you. Quite a challenge to speak after such a magnificent presentation, of course. So let me make a Swedish try at being, the usual Swedish, calm. Thank you, of course, to both of you. Very interesting presentations from very different perspectives, of course. Obviously, we have important decisions to make in Europe in the next few years. I think it should be said, before I go into the criticism, that many parts of the action plan are important. I can mention the cross-border transfer of seat as an example of something that Sweden believes is important and worthwhile working on. However, as you know, there are concerns from the Swedish government. Basically, I would say that there is a general flaw in the debate. And that's the fact that the financial crisis is blamed on poor corporate governance in companies in general. And I would just give you an example. There are a lot of industrial companies that have gone bankrupt. The Swedish automotive industry is about to go all over bankrupt in the last few years, and nothing of that has some sort of been a game changer in Sweden as a whole. Whereas banks going bankrupt is something completely different. So I'm not, sending the buck on to Urban, but I think that's a very important distinction to make between companies in general and the financial industry, which means that many of the measures put on the table by the Commission will not solve any problem, or actually not even that. They're trying to solve the problems that are not even in place. We believe, at the end of the day, in the Swedish government, that the market economy is a good thing. We believe that the creative destruction and the survival of the fit is good, which means that overly overly regulate markets. And again, I'm speaking about the non-financial parts of business. That overly regulating would be a bad thing. The basic principles should be there to the protection of property, the comply or explain, and so on. And just to finish off with I mean, there's lots of things to comment, of course. Just to finish off with one thing that I really do believe is important in what was said lastly, and that's the distinction between regulations and content. I was at a conference in Russia last week, and the Russian government talked for hours about how they have all regulations in place to combat what's the word? Corruption. Thank you. They had all the systems in place. They could tick all the boxes. Even many international organizations were in place and talked about how Russia had ticked all the boxes and how well they had been taken care of when visiting Russia to check that all the boxes had been ticked. But obviously, as the federal judge in place in the panel said, they're not even in the game for real. And I think that's important. No comparison whatsoever in other aspects, of course, between the two issues. But I think it is important to see the difference between content and regulations. And I think that's a point that we really have to carry with us. Okay, that's just a quick starter.
Paul, you mentioned that the Swedish corporate governance model is becoming more known and respected across Europe. Urban, you're involved in sort of explaining the Swedish corporate governance model in Brussels. Do you agree with Paul?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to remember that I'm, of course, responsible for kind of conveying the Swedish message. But I'm also responsible for conveying back the message to Magnus and my colleagues in the ministry here, and also to the industry, about how other member states and the Commission and the Parliament perceive and look at the Swedish model. I mean, it is true, as Magnus said, that it's important to kind of distinguish between the financials and the non-financials because of the crisis in the financial sector. I mean, there was a real concern and there were challenges, as Paul could also point at, in that industry, in the kind of corporate governance field. But that has also meant that we now have some kind of dangerous templates when we start talking about corporate governance in the non-financial sector. I mean, in CRD4, in the Capital Requirements Directive, I mean, we now have limitations on the number of board directorships, etc., that you may have, that may or may not be relevant. I mean, the exact numbers were kind of disputed. I think we on the Swedish side wanted, the possibility to have to let directors have more directorships, for example, than what was finally in the proposal. But again, it's a give and take. And I think, to be fair to Paulina and the Commission, I think that the Commission is doing, and Commissioner Barnier, with whom I'm in quite a lot of contact, is, of course, I mean, he's driving his agenda, an agenda that has been properly presented. And I think he's a very kind of well-known and good politician in the sense that he can also feel where actually ministers have real problems. So I think the outcomes could have been worse if we had not had the Commission by the table. But on the other hand, of course, the Commission is restricted by the fact that its actions has to be approved more or less by the other member states. And one could always ask, of course, the Commission proposals. I completely agree personally that the proposals may not be the end solution, but are they completely wrong? Probably not, or perhaps not. But in the end, I mean, there's something more needed. Or is it? I mean, we must recognize that we come from a society where we look a lot at a quite well-functioning self-regulatory system, but we don't have that in place all over Europe.
So, Paul, now you have a unique chance here to get some advice from an expert or somebody who has an outsider's view on the Swedish model. If you, Paul, were to give advice to Magnus and Urban here, if they were sitting across the table with other member states and explaining the Swedish model and the benefits, what are the punchlines that they should bring to the table?
Well, I took great encouragement from Paulina's last slide, which talked about recognition of national cultures, practice, diversity, legal structures. I think it's important that remains clearly in Barnier's mind, and that nothing in the EU's actions here should place at risk the Swedish model. And indeed, I would like to see Barnier be more open in his encouragement of investor involvement in the appointment of directors. They needn't necessarily be members of the committee. They could they could be they're in a representative function. You could adopt the Swedish model in the UK initially for the appointment of chairman only, very important appointment. The failure of our two biggest banks was almost entirely due to the weakness of the chairman in each case. So I would like Sweden to feel proud of what it's done, to continue to promote the debate about your particular distinctive contribution to global governance, and absolutely make sure that there's nothing in the EU proposals which are damaging. One area where I can see damages is this limitation on the number of directorships that people can hold. Banks are certainly different. Barclays commissioned a report on their problems, and by a senior lawyer, and Anthony Saltz, he said that non-executive directors who chaired committees would have to give 160 days a year to that task. This begins to question what a non-executive director is, but I think we must avoid being too prescriptive here. I think the key thing is the shareholders, if they were doing their job properly, they would decide whether the directors were taking on too many jobs. It's not for the EU to say you can do 3 jobs but not 4. It's for the shareholders to answer that question. Are there areas where the EU might be a threat to the Swedish approach? Mandatory rotation of auditors? The answer there is not mandatory rotation. It's the shareholders taking a greater interest in the process. I just want to say one other thing on gender, where I just evidence of that, where I think that the EU has just got itself completely confused. It says the 40% target does not apply where the workforce of the company has more than 90% of its employees from one gender. There's no link. There's no explanation of why that is. I'm finding it very difficult to believe of any industry or company which doesn't have at least 10% of male employees. The only industries where I can think where there won't be at least 10% of female employees are probably mining and deep sea fishing, which are probably in aggregate about 0.2% of the European economy. This takes up a page and a half of the European proposals. It's just nonsense. And so Paulina, I want to encourage you to go back to Michel Barnier and say, let's get back to some basic principles. And in particular, let's learn from Sweden, which really seems to be doing rather well in this area.
It appears that when following the debate at the EU level, there appears to be a new tone in framing the problem as a lack of long-termism. I mean, and that it's going in your direction, Paul, in some ways. And of course, then the link is to the Swedish model. We have differentiated voting rights, the industrial holding companies that are owners of companies for for sometimes 100 years. Do you see that this is improving Sweden's position in the discussion in Brussels? The focus on long-termism.
Yes, I think so, for sure, because I mean our model has proven to be quite good in the long run. So from that point of view, I mean everybody knows, and everybody is quite jealous of I mean, when coming up to Stockholm, looking at this as somewhat of an oasis in Europe, where we do not on a daily basis talk about the crisis, etc., where we just talk about how much room we have in the budget to kind of increase spending, etc. That's a luxury that you don't find elsewhere in Europe. And of course everybody is aware of that. They know about our major corporates. They even know about Minecraft and the new companies that kind of spring from Sweden. But that being said, I mean, there's just so much that the government can do to promote this, because the government, I mean, we only have so many kind of bargaining chips in the European negotiations. So, for example, in CRD4, we had a focus also on other things. We fought hard to increase the number of directorships. I mean, it would have been worse if we had not had our part in the game. On the other hand, I mean, what is important is, of course, that we see more representatives of Swedish enterprises in Brussels, seeing commissioners, seeing parliamentarians, seeing different stakeholders. Because even though the Swedish permanent representation, we're about 70 representatives of the Swedish government down in Brussels. I mean, Magnus and his colleagues and the ministers come from Brussels, come to Brussels frequently. But I mean, it makes much more of an impression if you have the leaders from the big corporates, for example, coming down, and we see a few examples of those, but they could for sure there could be for sure be more of them. You know, to tell from the corporate perspective, to tell the commissioners, the parliamentarians, how well this system works and how it works, because I mean we have to explain it on a daily basis about the shareholders getting involved. But I mean, it also means, of course, that we must be able to present a case. I know that we are doing, for example, a lot on the kind of gender equality and diversity area. But I mean, please go down and tell them, and please also make sure to improve the numbers from year to year so that we really have a case. Mm-hmm. And also explain, perhaps, if there is a case, how an increased number of directorships have actually improved the workings of our corporates. Because if we get a lot of questions from the other member states, okay, but what is so good with your model? Mm. Of course, up here everybody knows about it, but down there they are more concerned about the Polish model or the French model or the UK model, and of course in the corporate governance field, what about the Japanese model or the American model or the Brazilian one? Mm. So I mean, we do have a case, but we need to improve it more or less on a daily basis, and we must communicate it better, and there must be more of us coming down there to communicate.
And Paul, have you been to Brussels to try to affect the debate there locally?
Yes, I have, and I used to go to ECOFIN meetings, and that's when I first got to know Anders Borg, who's the outstanding finance minister in Europe of his generation. I had to deal with Europe on regulation with Mats Odell when he was Minister for Financial Services on the Alternative Investment Fund Management Directive, when the UK and Sweden found themselves very aligned, but I was also exposed to European decision-making processes where you often found that the price of getting something on the AIFMD directive was to agree to smaller fishing nets for sardines to satisfy the Portuguese, and one had to say this is why, again, I start by saying I'm pro-European, but this is how decisions are made in Europe. And I'm sure that Urban would recognise what I'm talking about. But I think Urban is absolutely right that Swedish business leaders, Swedish investment leaders should go to Brussels and talk about what you've got here. It would be wonderful if your approach was adopted elsewhere. It will take a long time because there are huge vested interests. Why would a chairman, Mr. Tresco, want to give up his right to appoint the board to a group of investors? So perhaps not be evangelical, but absolutely make sure that nothing is done in Europe which threatens your approach in Sweden and Scandinavian countries.
But Paul, is EU the right level to deal with these issues, or should it be done nationally?
It should be done by shareholders.
But how will we get the share?
Auditor remuneration. Company law in almost every jurisdiction in the world says the auditors are appointed each year by the shareholders. They're not. They're appointed by the board. And they're not even appointed by the board. They're appointed by the finance director and the executive directors. The shareholders should be involved in that process. The shareholders should sit on the committee that reviews the performance of the internal auditors. And perhaps there should be a presumption that the auditors be rotated every 6 years or 10 years, unless there is a compelling argument why that should not happen. But it's not for people in Brussels to force that. It's for the shareholders. It's their moral duty to behave as owners. And if they fail in their moral duty, then they should be exposed to legal action as failed fiduciaries.
So it's shareholders is the heart of the matter, very clear. So now it's your turn. to get a chance to ask questions to Paul and the rest of our panel.
Yes. I think we should let Paulina speak, don't you?
Yes, please. Please.
Thank you. Excuse me, a couple of points. First of all, just to take up on Paul, on your last remark, it's not Brussels deciding things. It is the member states on the one hand and the European Parliament on the other hand. The Commission is there as a kind of facilitator, but at the end of the day, we are not the ones imposing anything on anyone. I think this debate is very interesting because it shows how difficult this area actually is. And Paul, you said quite rightly that having an architecture does not guarantee the outcome. I think that's right. On the other hand, I also think that where the EU can have an added value is trying to have an enabling framework, to setting up some kind of architecture where then hopefully most of the different corporate governance models can fit into. And I think that is the way we are looking at it. I mean, this is clearly not an area where we can regulate every single detail. We are trying, I mean, I agree with you, the key here is shareholders. The question is, what can the legislator do to force shareholders to take certain responsibilities? In the action plan, we came up with certain ideas which we think, and I think we still think, are going in the right directions. They are probably not the only answer, but I think the issue here is really how much can the legislator do here. And I think the legislator can do a framework, he can put out certain indications, but at the end of the day, this melts down the shareholders, and it's not only the legislators going to change behaviors. So I think we are in a process here, but where I think that the law is one element, but you also need other factors. I would very much agree with what Urban said in terms of how you interact in Brussels, trying to discuss, communicate with the Commission, but of course also with members of the European Parliament and other member states. It is very useful to, and I think Swedish companies could do more in terms of coming down and explain the model. Some do, as Urban rightly pointed out, but I think we could, or Swedish companies could do better. Having said that, though, I think the important thing when you speak to policymakers in Europe is to realize that what we have in mind is 27 and soon 28. So just sending a message that our model is perfect, don't change anything, and please copy it, that's not going to work. So you will have to engage in a little bit more constructive way, saying, we believe that there are a couple of elements in our model that works very well, that we think could work also in other member states, and why don't we work along those lines? Because what we dislike very much is to just be told, don't change anything for us because our system is perfect. May well be the case, but it doesn't help for us because we need to have this broader perspective of the internal market and the soon 28 in mind.
Okay, so Swedish businesses should get involved more, but they should not think that that they should convey the Swedish model as having all the solutions to everything. Okay. Very good advice, thank you. Yes.
You're right in all what you're saying, Paulina, but just a few comments. I think you're diminishing the role of the Commission when you say that the Commission is solely a facilitator between the member states. I mean, the Commission does have a monopoly on putting proposals on the table, so your role is a bit bigger. But I think, and I think all the questions that you put on the table are correct. But I think the question is, and we can see that in with other commissioners as well, is the Commission's view on where Europe is going. And what we see from the Swedish government, I think, in general, is that we see a supranational Commission. They want to build structures that are supranational. Whereas, and I come from the Justice and Home Affairs part of the structure, more perhaps than this structure, but in that structure we talk a lot about mutual recognition. We talk a lot about the national states having their affairs, and the Commission, Europe, trying to integrate between the different systems, as opposed to trying to build multinational structures or supranational structures. And I think that's one of the key issues, actually, not to try to put the same system everywhere, but to try to facilitate cohabitation between different systems. Because at the end of the day, let's say that we would have had a unitary system of corporate governance. And let's say that we would have opted 15 years ago for the Italian model. What would that have been doing to Europe? I mean, the good story, of course, would have been if we had opted for the Swedish model. Thank you. But that's not certain. And looking at it from this point to the future, I think it's important to have this this cohabitation between different systems. I think that's my point, basically. Thanks.
Did you comment, Paul?
No, I appreciated Paulina's argument. I suppose, Paulina, if you were still in an interim stage, I would be saying to you, I mean, I'm not opposed to any of the 16 things in the action programme. I just don't think it's going to make a great deal of difference. I think you don't ask enough about the shareholders. You don't ask enough about fiduciary responsibilities, because my contention would be that fund managers had a responsibility to care for the assets that had been entrusted to them, and that prima facie evidence they failed to meet that responsibility, and that they should therefore be exposed to some form of accountability. I would also argue that perhaps the people who appointed the fund managers were negligent in the objectives they set, or at least had not thought through thoroughly those objectives, which, for instance, compelled fund managers to own banks whether they wanted to or not, because they were so big in the index that you couldn't afford not to hold them. That those fund owners should be held to a higher standard of behaviour and much greater scrutiny. And the 16-point programme doesn't really focus on that area at all. You're accepting that there are flaws as a result of distributed ownership. And you are trying to manage those flaws rather than going back and saying that distributed ownership is a source of the problem, and we need to ask ourselves why we have such distributed ownership. Because nobody 50 years ago decided that the best form of commercial ownership for Western European businesses was largely through the agencies of financial intermediaries, most of whom had investments in just about every company. Because they were reducing their stock-specific risk. There's a social element here as well, Pernilla, which I think is very important. You would normally assume that the owner of the business had real interest in the long-term health, sustainability, and future of the company, and that would give encouragement to suppliers, customers, and importantly, employees. The reality under our model is that most owners have what they describe as low stock-specific risk. They have so diversified their portfolios that they have little interest in any company. Indeed, optimization requires them to be comfortable with some corporate failures. So the owners of the business don't really care very much about the long-term future. They have about as much interest in the long-term health of a company as somebody putting a wager on a horse in a race. They care passionately about what that horse does in the next 3 minutes. They don't care much which hamburger it ultimately ends up in 20 years later. On the other hand, employees have huge stock-specific risk. They work for one company. And so you've got an employee who is highly dependent socially on a company, and you have owners who really don't have much of a long-term interest in what happens to the company. This is a fundamentally flawed model, Paulina, and that's really where the Commission should be focusing its efforts rather than on encouraging cross-border SME mergers.
So, Paulina, is the issue of dispersed ownership on the agenda? Do we have a microphone?
That's good.
Of the Commission, the issues that Paul addresses here, is that anything that's on your horizon?
Well, I think Paul makes a very valid point, but also I think pinpoints the problem the Commission faces here. Because if we were to say that we don't think dispersed ownership is a good model, it has to change. Then we would immediately be criticized for again going into nitty-gritty details. This is traditions we have in certain member states, in particular a tradition which maybe is not more than 50 years old, but indeed it is tradition now, where ownership is very dispersed. So we are trying to square the circle here in terms of being as general as we can, still acting on at least some of the flaws that we are observing in the market. On the other hand, if we are too detailed, if we go too much into what member states would consider to be their kind of core of their tradition or whatever, we are on very difficult territory. So that's a little bit where we find ourselves, trying to strike the right balance here. I also, as a comment on to what Magnus said, it's I think it's a fundamental question which goes far beyond this forum to say where should Europe be tomorrow or in 5 years or in 10 years from now. And it's of course a crucial issue here. Do we go towards more integration or rather the other way around? I think that's a very interesting debate, but it's probably for another occasion.
Well, we will continue to discuss this during this series of seminars. One final question to the panel, and that is, will there be, on the issues that Paul addresses here, on dispersed ownership, the problem of the ownerless companies, will we see real change in addressing this problem? Start out with Paul. Are you being heard?
I'm an optimist, and I think that, and I am a fundamental believer in the fact that the human race will continue to improve its condition. And I was talking to the Minister of Finance in Spain last week, and we both came to the conclusion that muddling through normally is the way we solve crises, and we are muddling through current crises at the moment. Just let me say one more. I mean, where it would be quite helpful would be if we fostered more awareness of academic research. Investment management must be the only business activity which completely denies any academic and scientific research of the last 50 years. Eugene Farmer, first of all, told us about the efficient market hypothesis. 50 years ago, we knew about random walk. We know from performance figures that active management through diversified portfolios does not produce returns which are superior to throwing a dart into the back page of the Wall Street Journal and building a portfolio by that method. We know that M&A destroys value, and yet we still continue to have this approach to fund management and this approach to M&A. Can you imagine going to your doctor, somebody building a bridge, somebody designing an airplane, and say, forget everything we learned over the last 50 years. Do it the way we used to think it was back in 1950. There's a remarkable failure by agents to recognize the wealth of academic evidence that says that the current dispersed model of ownership and disengagement by owners, failure to be involved effectively in governance and in the performance of boards leads to suboptimal outcomes.
And Urban and Magnus, do you have anything to add to that?
You just stole my answer, so now we'll steal his book. I'm an optimist, so my answer is yes.
Yes, I do, however, think that looking at the recent austerity debate, I think also academic research may have its flaws, but
yes.
But what we have to consider, and again, it may sound like I'm defending the Commission. I am sometimes we are quite opposed to the Commission proposals. But I think one has to consider. Yes, I completely agree with Paul that perhaps we should have seen proposals in other fields as well, or at least there were other areas that may be more important than the ones that the Commission has covered in their proposals. On the other hand, I think that also shows that, as we also say, I mean, we can agree to a number of the proposals or ideas, etc., and then we may discuss the details, whether they fit into our existing models or not. But I think one has to also say that I mean, in the proposals, they say that, yes, I mean, there is not one size fits all, which is, well, not new, but I mean, I think that's been underlined, emphasized even more. And we should look at the fact that we have soon 28 member states. The corporate governance structure didn't really work in any of those places, or it worked more or less well in all of these member states. So in a way, I mean, in Europe today, as we have 28 or so different systems, we actually have a perfect laboratory. So I mean, let's go and pick the best in all of these systems. And I think the message that I quite often send back home, and which is also listened to, is, of course, don't only convey the message about what's good in our system, but also have an open mind to kind of what's good in other systems. And perhaps if we should we could perhaps be a bit more constructive in that sense, and kind of taking part in the debate, because not only do we have, yes, I mean, the Commission presents the proposals, but then it's up to the Council, but above all now the Parliament, where they may have, talking about short-sightedness, especially now when we have a European Parliament election coming up. In a way, in some files we have seen that we're beyond logic. So it's all a matter of politics and what's a good headline on a press release. So we have to be very careful about kind of where we end up there. But
more constructive was your advice to lobbyists. Yeah. Okay, everyone, this was a wonderful discussion, and especially the remarks from Paul here was absolutely brilliant, and I think it's been very, in this series we've mostly listened to academics, and this was some real flesh and blood perspective on these issues, as well as a clear message to listen to academics, so that we like here at SNS. So warm hand for Paul Myners and the rest of the panel. And the next seminar on this series will be after the summer, and then we will discuss governance of banks, which we did pick up on today. So welcome back after the summer.
Nice meeting you.